Excellent. Thanks very much, everyone, and welcome to this session on, basically, it's a big world out there, and how can the UK take advantage of that. My name is Kamal, Ahmed. I'm the BBC's business editor. Thanks very much to the Policy Exchange for hosting this and inviting me to chair it. Also, thanks to Tesco. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this, but I will anyway. I was due to chair a similar event at Labour last Monday, but sadly Tesco announcements about other issues meant that I was in Manchester for precisely 1 hour. I got the train up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was back to London on the 10 o'clock train from Manchester that same day after Tesco's announcements about some of its accounting issues, which I'm sure would all be cleared up in the fullness of time. So it's good to have you all here. As I say, we're talking here about how can UK Plc innovate to help Britain win the global race. I mean, clearly, it's a well-worn and well-known argument that the big growth economies are maybe not our traditional trading partners, with the Eurozone in a rather sclerotic state, as we know it is. Where do we find the opportunities for the UK's exports to really make a difference to the way our economy is operating? The old joke that we export more to Belgium than we do to India is often one that is made. 2/3 of growth is coming from what are called emerging economies, but actually emerging might be something of a misnomer now. Clearly, businesses in terms of confidence want a stable policy environment, which I think is very important. How do UK firms build relationships that are sustainable and successful in markets often where there is little intelligence, particularly for smaller businesses, I think is interesting. What role does technology play in terms of bringing down global barriers, bringing down international hurdles to trade? What's the role of bigger businesses like Tesco and many others that have a very major global footprint? How can they support, should they support their suppliers, smaller businesses who help them be the businesses that they are, to also be able to expand abroad? How do you spot opportunities? How do you understand local markets? Other thoughts are about financing development. What is the best way to have a finance arrangement that allows you to take the risk of trying to explore new markets? Sometimes that can be something that can be high up a risk register, but the rewards might be great. What is the role of the government? UKTI, the Foreign Office, William Hague, when he was still Foreign Secretary, made a very big deal at the beginning of the coalition government that he wanted embassies to be seen not purely as diplomatic centres of excellence, but of commercial centres of excellence. And I think there have been a good deal of improvements in that area. Before I took over this job, I was business editor of the Sunday Telegraph, and certainly did a lot of work, particularly with UKTI and smaller businesses, on how they can take exports and grow their businesses via that in what is, as I say, a very tough European economy. I am joined by four huge brains to help us navigate this difficult subject. On my far left is Adrian. Let's welcome Adrian. He's the co-founder and chief operating officer of the entertainment service Blinkbox, which is music, books, movies and TV. Now, he is an entrepreneur extraordinaire, but interestingly sold his business to Tesco in 2011. Before founding Blinkbox, he was at Vodafone, where again he was involved and in charge of their approach to data and how data can help businesses flourish. To his right, it's Steve Hughes, the head of economics and social policy at the Policy Exchange. Previously, Steve worked at the Bank of England in the Banking Services Directorate, and also before that was at the British Chambers of Commerce, and did a lot of work looking at issues like Treasury legislation, which was an important part of its relationship. To my right is Nadhim Zahawi, MP, very well known MP. Nadhim, we obviously were on a panel last year about banking and financing, which could be part of this discussion. He's the MP for Stratford-upon-Avon, has been since 2010. In 2000, he founded YouGov, and in 2008, he was named the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. He wrote one of the most interesting books on the financial crisis with Matt Hancock, now the business secretary, called Masters of Nothing: How the Crash Will Happen Again Unless We Understand Human Nature. A book not much loved by the banking community, but one that raised a lot of very, very important points. In 2013, he was appointed to the Prime Minister's Policy Board to look at business and economic policy and how the government can engage with businesses in the best way. To our far right is Gerard Grech. He is the Chief Executive of Tech City, probably one of the most, well, some might argue one of the most important developments in technological development and encouraging innovation in East London. Silicon Roundabout, as it's sometimes not very sexily known. Before that, he was head of global marketing for BlackBerry, and before that was at Nokia in New York, as well as Orange. So I'm going to ask for short presentations, starting with Adrian on our far left for a few minutes. The presentation will obviously be sagely and erudite, and if they're not, I'll butt in. But a few minutes of that, and then let's throw it open to you, the audience. I've got a few thoughts on some questions, but it'd be much better if they came from you. We can make this into a discussion. So Adrian, why don't you kick us off? Thanks very much.
So I hope I can be sagely and erudite. It's quite a billing. I'm going to take it in the technology direction. I think, it's very much a belief of Tesco that digital technology is critical to driving innovation and Britain's long-term success. Technology is changing everything we do. You all have a supercomputer in your hands, some of you, and some of you in your pockets. It is more powerful than some of the computers used to put man on the moon. That power is extraordinary, and the innovation that it can unleash is extraordinary. We spend more time with our smartphones and tablets than we do sleeping. So the innovation in the information that people have at their fingertips and the decision making that they can use and use those devices to make it is absolutely critical. And for me, it's empowering the next generation of entrepreneurs. It is so much easier to start a business today than it's ever been. The costs are now marginal. Many of the accoutrements of starting a business are fractionalized, which you can buy and use on a marginal basis, which doesn't saddle a new business with the costs of trying to get going. And digital innovation is critical for all business. Technology is disrupting everything. It's no longer the bastion of digital upstarts like Google, Amazon, Facebook, but companies like Tesco. The business model's being upended and rebuilt in multiple different ways. For us, leadership in technology is the nexus of three things: skills and people, access to capital, and most importantly, infrastructure. And I'll come back to infrastructure in a second. Tesco has a long history of investment in technology and innovation. We're one of the very first to go to market with an online supermarket, which is very, very successful, and recently won Online Supermarket of the Year. We've led in multi-channel. We've developed something called the Innovation Labs, Tesco Innovation Labs, which brings together product managers and people at the front line with our technologists to come up with new and different things. Blinkbox, as Kamal alluded to, is a very exciting innovation for Tesco. We were very privileged to be bought by Tesco. It gives us a tremendous platform and an opportunity for growth. To give you an order of magnitude, we've gone from 20 engineers to 200 engineers in the time that Tesco has been our owner, which has helped us transform the business no end. We've seen 250% year-on-year growth. And the skills that we have and the understanding of technology and the sorts of things that can be done with it, Tesco's now leveraging. And a good example of this is Huddle. We worked closely across the business to bring Huddle to market. Huddle has sold over 500,000 units, and it's a fantastic example of democratizing technology and allowing everybody access to a tablet and all of the opportunities that it provides. But Tesco's investment isn't just cash, it's also in people. we spend a lot of time and effort trying to bring people through, trying to invest in the skills required for us to compete. And competition is the crucial element to this. It's never been more competitive to be in business. It's never been more difficult and challenging to be in business, particularly because of the innovation that is going on around us. And it's not just the bastions of Tesco that will lead this innovation forward, it's small companies too. And as big companies win, small companies also win as we work together to start to foster the things that we need. So how do we foster digital innovation? Well, the first thing I spoke about is skills. More investment in skills. We welcome the advancements in the curriculum. We welcome the desire to educate young people, but how we bring them through and how we start to bring them into the workforce is absolutely critical. There's one thing learning about all of the great things that we can do, learning to code, learning to be a product manager, learning to undertake user interaction, design, user experience, but it's another thing to put them into practice, and it's another thing to understand the process that is required to bring really exciting, innovative products to market. The second thing is infrastructure, and I couldn't stress this enough. As the COO of an online streaming business, access to broadband is absolutely critical. A 2 megabit speed for the country is just simply not good enough. If we really are to drive digital innovation and our entrepreneurs of the future can harness all of the opportunities that are presented to them, they need to be able to do that from wherever they are, not just central London or Birmingham, but wherever they are, and we think this is critical. I look forward to a digital future. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for Britain. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for companies like Tesco to contribute, and I think that it's really exciting.
Thank you, Adrian. Adrian, can I push you a little bit on the actual question, so to speak, which was about the global race?
Yeah.
Yes, clearly technology has got a role in reducing barriers to entry, and in its way that could raise some negatives as well as some positives, i.e. 1,000 ideas can flourish, but 999 of them might be rubbish. But the more sort of pertinent point of this discussion is about the global race and about exports and about emerging economies, and how has your relationship with Tesco allowed you a footprint which is a global footprint rather than simply possibly a more UK-focused footprint?
I think you're absolutely right. Tesco's market position internationally affords us a customer relationship to build from. To your point, 1,000 good ideas are no good unless they can be brought to market and unless they can scale very rapidly. Tesco's investment internationally gives us an opportunity to do that. Having said that, understanding and perfecting the product first before you roll it out is absolutely critical. If you can't win in your home market, there's no point going internationally. And I think for us, Tesco's given us that huge opportunity to understand and innovate the product domestically. And we have every ambition in the future of going international.
Great, thank you. Steve.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Just to pick up where Adrian left off really, is Adrian talked about the way that technology has changed the way we do business, the way we consume, the way we're educated. And with the advent of technological advancement comes different challenges for public policy, and the challenges come in relation to workforce, infrastructure and how open we are as an economy as well. And going back to the coding, computing element of the curriculum, this isn't designed to create an army of people leaving school or going to university. They're going to build the next big app. It's building a workforce that's capable in the future of utilising technological skills as well as the other range of skills that they need to operate in a modern economy. And I mean, the point is that there's kids starting school within the last kind of month might well be going into jobs that frankly don't exist yet, given the pace of change that we're experiencing in the global economy. But with those new skills for the workforce that's coming through, there's also an element that we need to consider about the workforce or the people that are left behind by technology as well. And I'll take banking and technology and banking as a specific example. As banks have embraced technology, it means that there's less need for bank branches around the country, and a lot of banks are closing branches because footfall has fallen and simply don't need them because they're high cost elements of the business. Now, the RBS boss said recently, quite famously, that their busiest branch was the 701 between Reading and Paddington. And 167,000 people use their online mobile app between 7 and 8 in the morning. And that's the way banking's changing. But at the same time, we've got 10 million people in the UK that don't have basic digital skills. And that means they can't send an email or have never used a search engine. So how do those people engage with technology and take the advantages of it as well, and what is the role of the state within that? Adrian talked about infrastructure. Yes, it's very important that broadband speeds, etc., are up to speed. I think there's an element of this as well that links to what we want from the UK economy in terms of investment in infrastructure, not just in the southeast and London, but how that kind of infrastructure can help those areas of the UK that aren't necessarily as profitable as the rest of them as well. And the final point on openness would be things like, so we have a situation where the government has got rid of post-work study, post-study visas for non-EU students studying STEM subjects. And that means there's been a drop-off in students taking up those courses. These are mobile people who can travel anywhere in the world to do these courses, and it now means that those people are going to be travelling to other countries doing research in other universities and benefiting their economies rather than ours. That's the kind of technological element. There's two other things I'll talk about. The first is infrastructure investment more generally. Infrastructure investment, the economic case is quite straightforward, whether it's housing, energy, transport, all of it feeds into business activity as inputs. And if we don't get infrastructure right, then it means our businesses are put at a competitive disadvantage. And there's loads of stats that I could use, but just to give you one on home building, for example, Policy Exchange is estimating we'll need to build 300,000 homes a year to cope with future demand, but also to make up for the shortfall in supply that we already have. We're currently building just over 100,000, so the problem's just getting worse. And the final thing I'll say is, as government as an enabler, is a point that Kamal made actually about was exporting and where we export to. The state really does have a role in helping businesses in gaining access to export markets first off, and also gaining access to new markets that they haven't necessarily utilised. On the point about Belgium and India, there is a point here as well about technology moving so fast that it's very difficult to for us to measure the economy full stop. One of the reasons that the stats for exports to Belgium is so high is because of something called the Antwerp effect, because the export statistics reference where freight and stuff is dropped off, but it doesn't register where it goes on beyond that. So they're going to Belgium and they go to Rotterdam, which is the other area where this happens, and then they're going on somewhere else in the world, which we simply don't know about. And the other thing about technology and measuring the economy, and the Bank of England uses things like Google searches now to try and ascertain elements and trends within the economy around house prices and those kind of things, because they are actually good predictors of what's happening. And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with technology measuring the economy. But from a practical point of view on exports, sure, we export around 50% of our goods and services to mainland Europe, and that's pretty obvious why we do that, because of the geographic proximity, because of less language barriers, because of the ways of doing business, because less regulatory requirements. Moving into new markets requires understanding of business practices, cultures, regulations in these markets that aren't necessarily familiar to UK businesses, and that's why they need UK TI to help them gain access to those markets. But the final thing I'd say is it's not going to happen overnight. It's not as if we start gearing UK TI support to those emerging markets, then all of a sudden the composition of our exports will change. It will probably take decades before we can change the composition of our exports to those more developing nations. And the final example I'd use is that quite a lot of trade routes that we use are to the former Commonwealth countries, and the reason that is because of hundreds of years of history. We need to try and make sure that public policy is designed to try and harness the fact that we could be exporting to these markets for decades, if not centuries, in the future.
Thank you very much, Steve. Steve, how would you mark the government's approach to supporting exports to new markets rather than traditional markets, in terms of, as I said, William Hague made a very big deal of this at the beginning. The government has made a very big deal of turning its embassies into commercial centres as much as diplomatic centres. Would you say that, as you say, it's a slow process, but actually, what mark would you give the government since the last election?
Mark out of 10, I'd probably go about 7 maybe. I think there's been a lot of good things. So the good things I'd say are the fact that there's a lot more just kind of open, we are on a trade mission, we are taking businesses out to these markets and being led by very senior people in the government. That's a good thing, and that certainly improves under the coalition. The second thing is reorientating UK TI to those developing markets. That is a very good thing as well, and they seem to recognise that. UK Export Finance, which is the finance provision arm of the government, which was formerly the Exports Credits Guarantee Department, which was essentially at the margins of government before 2010, and that's brought back into the fold and is helping businesses as well. They're all good things. The obvious question mark is, and this is the same with any area of government policy, is whether they have the correct resources to be as effective as they could be.
Yeah.
But in an era where government budgets are under constant pressure, that's always going to be a problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Nadhim, give us an overview of where you think things are.
Well, the question was, how can UK Plc innovate to win the global race? And I think it's interesting that at an event with UK Plc in the title, the two businesses on the panel, albeit one is owned by a PLC, are actually in the tech sector, and in terms of size, statisticians would refer to them as SMEs. Of course, when we refer to UK Plc, we're often just talking about UK business, but in terms of the global race, it is mainly our very big corporates that are out there flying the flag and competing as recognised brands in the international marketplace. Yes, our SMEs are also there, but for many, and despite the support from UKTI, the challenges of exporting their products worldwide means they tend to stick to markets that they know. Yet, I believe that the winner of the global race will be the country whose businesses can innovate the most, innovate the quickest, and scale up. And SMEs are where we find the greatest innovation. In Tech City, it's the small, nimble startups that are using the web to create entirely new businesses we didn't have 5 years ago. In fact, entirely new markets that we didn't even think of, or sectors that we didn't think of. In the Midlands, it's the small university spin-outs that are creating the next wave of manufacturing technology. It's vital that we support businesses like these in their growth and in how they fund innovation. And we've done quite a lot of thinking, certainly at policy board level, and hopefully you'll see some of that in the manifesto. And I'm proud that that's what the government has been focusing on, or at least has tasked people like myself and Margot James and others to look at. We've got great schemes. CDIS is probably one of the most successful schemes that entrepreneurs tell me that help them to attract initial investment. And above the line R&D tax credit, allowing loss-making startups, of course, to recoup the cost of the R&D from the taxman. Our challenge, though, is how we stay ahead. High-growth countries like China and India seek to shift their economies towards innovation, clearly. British businesses and government are going to have to do much more to compete with these economies. Today, the innovation design comes from the West to be made in the factories of the East. If you look at the back of a new iPhone 6, then just above the bend, it proudly proclaims, designed by Apple in California, before going on to say, assembled in China. Or take Dyson, British engineers providing the innovation, China providing the manufacturing. The challenge is when China moves from being the world's workshop to being the world's design studio. And we shouldn't fool ourselves that this isn't going to happen. We've got a rising middle class and an ever-growing university-educated population, mean it is inevitable. Already our tech and web-focused companies are having to compete against those from China. And whilst in manufacturing, made in Britain may have a cachet on the web, that isn't the case. Look at Twitter versus Weibo in China, or the recent flotation of Alibaba, although, interestingly, one of Alibaba's biggest shareholders is Yahoo, leading to the strange situation where the stake they hold in Alibaba is larger than their market capitalization overall. Ultimately, there's a local cultural knowledge that's needed And we're perhaps naive if we think we can simply take our digital services from Europe or the US and just drop them into China's enormous internet market. Where we can do well, though, is in building a made-in-Britain brand for innovation. So Britain inside, if you will, by selling our unique brand of innovation as something special, in just the same way we do with products from brands like, obviously, Burberry's, Jaguar Land Rover, near my constituency, or Johnny Walker whiskey. If we can do this, then we can sell our innovation and underlying tech to those local companies, licensing models, such as those taken Arm Holding, who license their chip designed to everyone from Apple in America through to HTC and Lenovo in China, could be the way ahead for everything from underlying algorithms to entire technical solutions. Of course, in that regard, we have to make sure that the IP rights of our businesses are properly protected on an international level. I'd also like to say something about the role of big business in winning the global race. There are already great British businesses selling to the world and winning the global race. Just outside my own constituency, Jaguar Land Rover's Design and Innovation Centre is doing amazing work, and they're winning huge market share across the world. In fact, some of the great stats that we politicians trot out in terms of exports. If you look at that and take out JLR, they become less interesting. But they, like many British businesses, face steep import tariffs when selling into emerging markets. If our businesses are to compete on a global scale, then we need to make sure there's a level playing field on a global scale with trade deals that work for everyone involved. Now, this may involve some difficult conversations, but where we see unfair protectionism, we need to challenge it. That's part of government's role. That goes beyond the traditional support for exports. It's very interesting to hear what the room thinks. It's a big question.
Yes. Nadhim, does it suggest your argument that actually we will have, as a country, a more positive way forward by focusing on manufacturing and the made in Britain, and then underlying that technology, as you suggest, rather than trying to battle on a technological front with particularly India and China, where, as you say, the traffic might start going in the opposite direction?
Actually, my point was you compete on both,
yep.
But the challenge of scale, which we clearly don't have because we're a small population, then you overcome by being innovative on licensing. So rather than holding back and saying, well, actually, I will innovate here, build it here, and then go around the world.
Yes.
There may be other models that we follow that can actually give us that scale through licensing.
Yes. That
creates the sort of the companies of the future.
Mm-hmm. And on the issue of protecting IP, for example, I mean, China is one of the most dangerous countries for companies to invest in. If you speak to anyone from Cambridge Satchel to James Dyson, etc., 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 they have all had very bad experiences in China with counterfeiting.
Very true. And
what do businesses do?
They're getting more. Well, first of all, there is now an appetite within the Chinese administration to deal with this and deal with it in a much more serious way. And I think we've got to make sure that that actually happens. It's good for them. It's good for them in terms of their own sort of trust sort of quotient. If you look at how we behave towards them versus, say, the US administration behaves towards their tech companies, there's a real difference. But with that sort of openness and positivity that we approach them with, there needs to be a recognition that they have to change their behaviour.
Yes.
And behave in a equally positive way and a way that, and they get it because they need to move their economy anyway towards a sort of consumer-based economy, much more playing on a sort of level playing field rather than just sort of taking stuff, disassembling it and sort of just copying it and moving on.
Thank you, Nadhim. Gerard, give us a view from Tech City.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I guess, going back to the question, innovation really is about creativity. So if we're talking about nations and innovation, It's about how do you create the conditions for innovation? How do you create the conditions for creativity? And there's a number of ways you can tackle that, and I think I don't want to sort of repeat some of the things that have been mentioned, but it starts with confidence. It starts with foresight. It starts with your ability to see the trends and the changes that are taking place. And one big trend is obviously technology, which is why it takes political leadership of any country, of any nation, to say, this is happening, we need to take, make the most of this, which is why we've seen Tech City be so successful, because, and believe me, I am hosting many delegations from many other countries in Europe and also in Southeast Asia, trying to replicate and emulate some of the things that they've seen with Tech City. What this government and this coalition did was, just accelerate that development that was happening in East London. But we are now tasked with taking that in other cities, because we do believe that a lot of innovation will increasingly happen in cities. And there are some figures that show that by 2050, 70% of the world's populations will be in cities. And there's a book that I would recommend you reading, which is called Where Good Ideas Come From. And it makes the point that cities is where those ideas come from. And ideas equals innovation, equals creativity, equals foresight and confidence. So at the strategic level, I think we're seeing good signs of how do you turn consulate generals and how do you turn embassies into centers of excellence around the world. So strategically, I think we're seeing very positive signs. On the operational level and tactical level, I think you've seen some great, policies put in place. My colleagues have touched on this in terms of how do you unlock and release more capital into the system with the introduction of the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme that has been extremely welcomed in Tech City and other cities around the UK. But there's also, how do you ensure that cities are making the most of their regional heritage? I was in Sheffield only 2 weeks ago, and in Sheffield, you see, it's at the crossroads of the M62 and the M1, and there's a critical mass of distribution centers there, distributing products to many countries around the world. And there's a critical mass of understanding of how logistics work around distribution. Now, if you create an accelerator that can create that crossover between digital and existing industries, you will be well on your way of becoming a pioneer in technology, which is why London right now is the pioneer in fintech. There are more people working in Greater London in fintech than there are in New York or Silicon Valley. That didn't happen by accident. It's by the sheer fact that you've got digital crossover happening. And it takes political leadership to ensure that that continues to be the case in other areas, such as fashion, such as advertising. So the digital economy right now is worth about 10% of GDP. It is set to increase to about 16% by the end of the decade. So I guess I'll come back to the point about innovation and creativity. There are things you can do at a more tactical, operational level, like access to talent, and what you can do with universities, and why it is important to introduce coding and making it compulsory from the age of 5. It's not about creating a nation of computer programmers. It's about creating a nation with a workforce that are problem solving, that use coding as a way of solving a problem through logic. So then there's the physical side, making sure that there are spaces where people can work, making sure that airports and trains function and connect cities for increased collaboration, which is a very important part of innovation. So we have a role to play to ensure that London gives us a great story to tell, but the UK has to also connect to other cities. So that's why we're seeing centers of excellence in digital media in Manchester, cybersecurity in Belfast, robotics in Bristol, artificial intelligence in Edinburgh. So if a company coming in and looking at the UK, they don't just look at London, but they look at the whole of the UK being a network of digital excellence and technology excellence, where they can see complementary skills that make up the technology stack in what they're looking for, which is why Cambridge is so good in hardware and network design. But imagine when you combine that with the critical mass of expertise around user experience, application development in London, you've got a stack that is positioning the UK as a pioneer in Internet of Things. So you have to have foresight. You have to grab those trends and make the most of them. And then finally, the social aspect, the lifestyle, the alluring lifestyle that London has attracted. It attracts very good top talent from around the world. And clearly, it has to be driven from the ground up. And government intervention has to be very delicate. And which is why I think Tech City has been so successful, because it has been led by the community. It has been led by entrepreneurs. They know exactly what they need. And that's why you've seen policies be introduced that have been led by the community. One example of this is the introduction of the Exceptional Tech Talent Visa. Tech City UK is a designated competent body to the Home Office for digital technologies. It is the first of its kind in this country. So that came from the community. And I think it's how do you harness that? How do you make the most of that to ensure that as a country, we're at the forefront of this technological revolution that we're seeing.
Gerard, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. David Cameron once plaintively asked before the last election, why doesn't the UK have a Google? Do you want to have a stab at why that is the case?
Yeah, and I get asked this a few times. I mean, Silicon Valley is well over 30 years old, right? Ideas take time, innovations take time. And don't forget, the UK has invented the telephone, the light bulb, the internet, the jet engine. It just goes on and on. So there is a critical mass of talent that can really invent. Now, in the space of digital technology, I think it's a question of time. It's a question of time. And now is a great time to invest in the UK.
But if you look at Alibaba, yes, but Alibaba in 1999 launched in an apartment block in Hangzhou by Jack Ma and 16 other people.
Yeah.
Amazon, eBay, Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter. Britain, Arm, Autonomy, sold to HP. Yeah. I mean, there are big businesses. I mean, I think there's now only one Arm and, well, Sage, if you call Sage a technology company, in the FTSE 100. Where Gerard, I understand what you're saying, but is there an issue there, or do you think it's a question of patience?
Well, okay, so let me give you an example of, we've seen, so we run a program called the Future 50, and 4 of those companies from the 50 have recently listed on the London Stock Exchange. 2 of them had valuations of over 1.5 billion pounds. And the last time that happened was many, many years ago. So we're seeing early signs of it. However, to your point, it comes back to confidence. I think more can be done to ensure that you don't sell out early, that you take it all the way, which is why the London Stock Exchange has introduced a high growth segment for technology companies to make it easier for companies to list. So the understanding, the knowledge has increased substantially over the last few years, which has enabled, it's all about creating the conditions for even more innovation.
Fantastic. Can I bring you in that, Adrian? I mean, could you just have carried on and blinkbox could now be a floated company, comfortably in the 250 maybe, if not even, bigger than that? I mean, some might say, do you have any seller's remorse?
Oh, you asked me that question earlier. No, not at all. I think at the time where we were, the level of competition, we needed a bigger platform to be able to compete. It's slightly germane to the industry in which we operate, which the construct of which is such that it requires a substantial investment in capital to really be successful. Maybe we could have. But I think it was the right thing to do for our business, and it's been a really fantastic platform for us to grow to where we are.
Do you think there is a broader issue? I mean, to ask the same question that I asked of Gerard about Cameron's rather famous question about why doesn't Britain have a Google? Is there a bigger issue for UK generally about why we haven't? If you go through that long list.
I think historically, and it's changing tremendously, is access to capital has been an issue. And access to a lot of capital required to really grow has been an issue. The London VC community was small. The seed capital market that Gerard talked to was small. Starting a business was challenging, but that has changed a tremendous amount in the last 10 years. I think the other thing that has driven Silicon Valley is you've had a few people be successful and they've invested in more companies and they've invested in more companies and the thing has grown from that. You're starting to see some successes in Britain in terms of people creating big businesses and selling and starting to invest in new businesses coming through.
Yep.
And I think that ecosystem is growing and really starting to come through. And then the final point is you need some seasoned entrepreneurs to help mentor young entrepreneurs. It's not that easy to be an entrepreneur. There's no handbook for it. You can't really go and study for it. And the guidance that you can get from people who've been through it and seen it and done it is tremendously important, and that ecosystem needs to grow.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's have some questions. Hands up, hands up. Yes, sir. We'll have one here and one at the back. Fabulous. Do introduce yourself.
Yeah, Phil Clark Orpington. First of all, I'll just preface this by saying, Adrian, I hope you sold for cash rather than shares. Don't answer that. I'm sorry. God, I said the wrong thing. Okay, can I ask two questions which are very different, but just may move the conversation on a bit? First of all, Tesco bombed in the USA. Why do so many British companies struggle there? Secondly, my point is you've gamely tried to bring in all the great things government are doing. Can I bring in the other side of that, the dead hand of government? I went to a fabulous meeting this morning, chaired by Kamal, and I had a Finnish MEP there who brought along an oven glove, and he explained how the Finnish oven glove business has been decimated by European regulation, and they just can't make them anymore economically because of the cost of compliance with regulation. So what do we do about that? And secondly, I did promise a friend at home that I'd actually raise this at some point, dealing with the HMRC. She's had an appalling problem dealing with the tax authorities over a small £20 item. 13 letters have gone backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It's a problem dealing with government. How do we make it simpler to help business?
Very good, thank you so much. Well, Steve, given our sponsors, I'll ask you about Tesco. Why did it bomb in the US? Which I'm sure you'll answer robustly. But obviously, there's a broader point, which is not just a UK disease, but it's actually a Western developed markets disease, which I think is brought home very much so by eBay's attempt to launch in China against Alibaba and failed spectacularly there. Touching on issues like that, how do we understand? You touched on we have to understand culture, the economy, regulation, but we have, particularly in retail in America, UK companies have often seem to have completely misunderstood the markets they're trying to enter.
Sure. So on that point, on the markets point, when I used to work at the British Chambers, we used to provide export documentation to our businesses. So if you wanted to export a physical good, then you had to go through a Chamber of Commerce essentially to get some documentation. And so we saw a lot of businesses coming through that were trying to access new markets, and especially during the crisis, when it was going back to what you said, there was a situation where they were exporting to Europe and they said, well, this is my safe ground, but I can see it's going nowhere fast, so I need to try a new place. And they tried to export to new markets and they failed. And the reason, or the predominant reason that they failed, was that you had a lot of the infrastructure in place, and you had ability to transport our goods if it was a physical good. We had a contact over there that could help us deal with the local regulations and that kind of thing, but we just didn't really understand as fully as we thought at the time the market and how it operated over there. I don't know whether that's the same for Tesco or what happened with that, or whether it was just too many barriers to entry for them in that market, but there's certainly something about businesses not necessarily thinking they understood the market because they knew they had to, but not actually necessarily doing so. On the HMRC point, HMRC is an interesting one because I use this example in another fringe of the day, and actually HMRC is, believe it or not, one of the most efficient tax collection authorities in the world, and often the envy of other countries and everything else. That's not to say it doesn't have its problems. And there was always a huge disparity between how it treated and got on with massive companies which seemed to be quite a good relationship, and there's negative stories about sweetheart deals. I don't think they were necessarily that widespread, but if you speak to large corporates about HMRC, they're generally positive about them. You go to the SME market, and then the story is just a completely different one. I actually took a group of HMRC officials up to the Chamber of Commerce in the east of England to kind of do this kind of business government engagement thing. And I was astonished that one of the officials told one of the businesses that, quite frankly, he could be ringing an HMRC helpline number and the phone would be ringing in an empty room. That kind of service provision is pretty awful for SMEs, especially when they have to deal with the amount of regulation they do, and that's why often they just have to employ an accountant to do it for them at extra cost to them. Final point on the dead hand of the state stuff. I don't know if you've followed this at all, but it's an interesting point given the context of export support. But in America, there's been this huge debate recently about their export-import bank, and it's become quite a totemic issue for the kind of libertarians and the Tea Party in America about scrapping this institution which gives state support to exporters and businesses overseas to buy American goods. And there is a bigger debate there now about what the state can realistically do in the provision of finance to overseas companies. But in my view, I think the state absolutely does have a role in supporting finance and providing guarantees for finance loans and credit as well.
Thanks, Steve. Nadhim, tell us about the dead hand of government, or is it a more of a helpful hand? And the gentleman touched as well, of course, I'm sure the Finnish glove manufacturers are concerned about the dead hand of Europe, more particularly than the actual national governments. And the issue is that, let's say, as an argument, let's posit this, if the UK was not in the European Union, would that not encourage us to develop different relationships and trade relationships with the rest of the world, and frankly stop our maybe somewhat overly focused concentration on Europe itself? It would actually encourage us to the Commonwealth, to the Americas, to China and India. Sure. But because we have the European Union, we're sort of so focused on it that we can't sort of raise our eyes to new horizons.
Well, first of all, it doesn't need to be a trade-off. And
you're very much an and man, aren't you? It's always an and. Yes, absolutely. No, I understand.
Right. Secondly, British business does very well exporting to the European Union. If you look at all the surveys that have come through, even I did one earlier this week from manufacturers, they see our membership as important. There is a real opportunity to renegotiate. I spoke at an earlier fringe today. I talked about this government will be probably the first government in history to leave office with fewer regulations on business than when it took office in 2010 with the 1 in 2 out policy. The challenge is now for us to convince Brussels to do the same thing for business. And I think there is a positive direction of travel. If you look at Germany, the second largest party in Germany will be a Eurosceptic party, which will mean there will be movement in the direction that the UK, we're not alone in this, and I think we have the right policy to renegotiate and then put it to the country in or out referendum. I mean, let me just sort of fall back on my own experience in business in terms of the dead hand of government. When you're a small business, we launched YouGov in a shed in Great Corner Street, literally. We put some heaters in. And there were 2 of us, Stephen Shakespeare and myself, and then we had to hire other people. But then, you're everything. You are the salesman, you're the receptionist, you do the accounts, you do everything. So there's very little time for you to try and deal with the bureaucracy. And what would be nice is, for a startup, is for government, someone asked me earlier, what's the best thing government can do? I said, stay out of my hair when I'm launching a business, and maybe a thank you note to say I've actually launched a business, rather than a wad of forms that you've got to fill in. So, what I'd like to see, it now takes maybe 6 days to start a business in the UK, which is fantastic in many ways. I'd like that to become 6 hours. Why can't we have, maybe not an SME, a free enterprise, which can launch in 6 hours as a business? Because back to the Tech City success, that will make a huge difference in terms of more ideas, more innovation. I want to say sort of two things on one, picking up the point that Gerard made on creativity. I'd like to see STEM become STEAM. STEAM adding an A for the arts, because actually part of the creativity in tech, it calls to come from the arts, and it's great news that as well as coding that kids will learn at school, they can learn 2 Shakespeare plays, which is fantastic for the member part for Stratford-on-Avon, of course. But on the sort of the lack of success for UK retail in the States, it is in some sectors it's just very hard to break into the US market. My own experience, I can say in the research sector, we've been incredibly successful. Now that's partly because Americans are very used to Europeans telling them, what the data says, because they've had Nielsen, lots of GfK companies from Europe. And for YouGov, America will be the largest market. It already is by revenue, it will be by profit as well very soon. I sit on a board of a FTSE 250 company in the recruitment sector, which is highly competitive, highly developed, very old industry. Again, they've had extraordinary success in America. But for some reason, retail, and to be fair, it's not just Tesco. M&S with Brooks Brothers was a pretty painful experience for them.
Interesting. Gerard, how can technology help businesses based here understand international markets when it comes to will they be successful?
So, I think one of the challenges that we find talking to tech city-based businesses operating in the US is recruitment, because they're relatively unknown to some extent. And obviously the key people that you hire at the very beginning of your journey in the States is very much to do with the first people that you hire. So we're looking at that right now. So technology, having worked in Paris and New York and lived there, I can tell you that I've seen it many times before. Companies underestimate the cultural differences when it comes to, even though we are speaking the same language in the case of America, just very different ways of doing things. And it's not until you've hired someone that has lived and worked in that country as well as Britain that you get that sort of sympathy and empathy on both sides. So it's quite hard to find those people. But it's worth. I think what we're seeing is founders and CEOs realizing that they need to hire an HR director sooner than they think, because they actually sort of put that point. We've seen businesses that put that a lot later as a decision, but actually it's actually becoming much earlier, because we're seeing digital businesses in Tech City think global from day one now. It's not about, I'll just conquer the UK market. It obviously depends on the product that you're selling and the service that you're selling, but I've seen a lot of companies immediately think about the market being global. To your question, it's more the collaboration. It's not really what technology can teach you. I think you can obviously, clearly there are master classes you can do online, but it's not until you've experienced this, until you've had.
There's a people thing more than a data thing.
In that instance, of course, you've got a lot of, you can be as data-driven as you like. At the end of the day, it is about people.
Yeah.
Just like, sorry to say this, but there was a lot of data about why Britain didn't win the World, or why the UK, England didn't win the World Cup. At the end of the day, but I mean, there was a lot of data about.
We were rubbish, I think was the answer.
But the last match that we played against, I can't remember. We had possession of the ball over 65% of the time, and yet we still lost the game. So you can have data at your fingertips, but then you have to layer that with soft data, what I call soft data.
Yeah. Adrian, fresh and easy, what lessons are there for us all to learn about your somewhat troubled experience?
I can't comment on that. I can tell you about Blinkbox and the exciting things that we're doing.
What are the general lessons about understanding markets, particularly America, where I think Gerard makes a very apposite point, which is that I think a shared language often makes businesses slightly more confident and maybe overconfident. Well, America, Christ, that must be relatively straightforward.
Yeah. Well, as someone who's new to this country, as you can tell by my accent, there are definitely cultural differences in moving between different nations, and I think there is an underestimation moving into new markets of the subtleties of what are going on in the world, in that market. I think the important thing is understanding your own market, understanding the skills and what's made you successful in that market, and then having the understanding, and Gerard's point's absolutely right, and the people to help you interpret how you're going to win in the new market. It took me quite a long time. I mean, I've been here nearly 15 years. It took me quite a long time to understand how to operate in this market versus my own market. I knew what I was good at. I knew the sorts of things I could bring to the table.
What were the differences?
Differences.
Tell us some of that. That's quite interesting. Apart from playing croquet, obviously.
Well, we could talk about the cricket and the statistics and the sorts of reasons why we've been successful in that. No, I think.
Were there demand differences in terms of the population, what people expected, how you should operate?
I think the subtlety in behaviour and cultural differences is something that you cannot ignore, even if it's an English-speaking country. My own country is much more straightforward, and it took me quite a long time to understand that actually just coming out with it may not be the best route, and actually building consensus might be more required to move things forward. Equally in developing relationships, I found it much easier to develop relationships in my own country than I did necessarily here. But that's not to do with an insular perspective. It's just common ground. What's important and what's not important. I think if you look at innovation in the true sense of the word, I think you're bringing like-minded people together. And building a team is absolutely critical, and then how you use that team dynamic and the shared understanding of what makes a great team to then expand internationally and bring it forward. I mean, to pick up on the point on the arts, I wholeheartedly agree. I think one of the most interesting parts of the British economy is the nexus of that, what I would call user interaction design. I mean, too much emphasis goes on of teaching young people how to code. I mean, writing code, fantastic, brilliant. And you can write code to do many, many things, but how somebody actually uses it, how they interpret it, navigate the look, the feel is absolutely critical. And I think we should all be really proud of the sorts of things that we bring to the table. The fact that Apple's chief designer is a Brit says something about this country. It says something about the opportunities that it can bring together in driving innovation.
Yeah. Great. Lady at the back. Yes.
Hi. Victoria Wheel from John Lewis Partnership. Nadhim, you talked a lot about having a level playing field. And one thing that is still hampering British businesses like ours in investing and innovating is the fact that we pay a lot of tax and many businesses don't. They headquarter in Luxembourg and seem to get away with it. What are you going to do? What's going to happen? Osborne spoke some strong words yesterday about this, but still there seems to be rhetoric. I can't really see anything changing. They're not being really, companies like Amazon aren't really being held to account. Starbucks shamed into paying tax, but nothing's really changing yet.
Thank you. So the online issue, which, as I said, the Chancellor did raise yesterday, also raised in the budget, and one assumes will be raising in the autumn statement. Nadhim, what are you actually going to do rather than just talk about it?
Well, it's above my pay grade to even attempt to sort of,
He's dried up.
It would be very difficult for me to sit here and outline exactly what we're going to do.
But they should pay more tax.
And not make the headlines tomorrow.
You want them to pay more tax?
Absolutely should and pay the fair amount of tax that they should be paying. I think.
Is it more tax?
George Osborne made the point that, well, it depends which company, right? So.
Okay, well we know Google. We're talking about Google, Amazon, Starbucks. Should they pay more tax?
They should
in
pay
the UK?
The fair tax that they should be paying in the UK. Because as George Osborne said yesterday, they come here, they build very successful businesses because we've got pretty strong investment in infrastructure. They bring their employees here or hire more people here who take advantage of our great health service and everything else, then that all costs money and they should be paying the right taxes.
And the suggestion is that they're not at the moment.
Right, well, some of them go to extraordinary lengths to hide where they're, or create vehicles to lower their tax burden aggressively. When I was running YouGov, we had businesses across Europe, Middle East, America, now they're in Asia as well. And yes, we could have been much more aggressive in where and how we pay our tax. But I just thought, life is too short, and actually, doing the right thing wins you more business, and behaving properly, actually you do better. And some of these companies, if I were their leaders, I'd be sort of reading the writing on the wall on this stuff, because whether it's the UK and in many ways you need to act, whether it's G20 or whatever organisation try and put this through, because what you don't want is displacement activity. People just sort of deciding, oh well, the UK has got these punitive taxes or a system that penalises us in some way, but it's coming your way. And actually, those tech companies should be the first to embrace this stuff, because a digital world that's networked, that corporates can't really hide anything anymore. It would be stupid to think that they can hide these things in some way. If you're making money in the UK, if your sales are in the UK, you pay tax on that.
Gerard, do you think they should pay, the Googles, Amazon, Starbucks of this world should pay more tax in the UK? No one can answer this question.
Well, I'm not a tax expert, but
there seems to be something about tech companies in particular that have hit the headlines about a rather slippery relationship with how much tax they pay to the exchequer, despite the UK often being their biggest market outside the US in terms of revenues.
A lot of companies do also pick the UK because it's a bridge into Europe, right? It's got a good international access. It's got a good pool of talent, a very strong pool of talent. What I see though is a lot of companies being extremely interested by the fact that Google is in the UK and has invested heavily in terms of employing lots of people, because they would like to, because those companies have churn. They churn employees, which then join the ecosystem and then go on to other companies in London and other cities around the UK. And I think that's a positive thing. And believe me, when a company is looking to hire someone from Google, it's a big deal, or Amazon, because of how these companies think, the DNA of these companies. So, I would say that
there's a reputation problem, isn't there, for tech companies in the UK, big tech companies in the UK that aren't UK companies. There's a reputation problem.
I think they have a role to play. I mean, in my area, they have a huge role to play in ensuring that the talent is as strong as possible. And because other countries are envious of the fact that we have such a strong ecosystem and such a strong pool of talent that is quite advanced in the thinking and operating these tools and computer language and how to deal with computer languages and different computer tools that you need to use to stay ahead. So,
Not sure you quite got an answer there, but I would watch for early December, I think, frankly. And the OECD did bring out their first initial findings on how to create a more equitable tax environment for the G20. So that may give some progress if the government backs some of that, I assume. I'm so sorry, got one more quick question, but we have we're literally just over, but there's one more quick question. I'm so sorry.
Turn this business around about,
yes.
Turn this thing around about transparency, trust, the licensing problems in China and so on. And there's the thought that trust in UK businesses may be one of our secret weapons.
Yeah.
In China, people are scared to buy Chinese foodstuffs. In India, they're scared to use Indian pharmaceuticals because you can't trust what it is. And so, just an example, Patients Know Best, a great personal healthcare informatics company from the UK, a social venture, which gives you, the patient, the only key to your code, so you know that your health data cannot be sold on without your consent.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing, I think, is
very interesting.
And They're introducing now a new profit with purpose business structure, introducing BLAB UK, which gives them accreditation to that sort of trust standard.
Yeah.
This
Very
could
good.
be.
Very good, that's very helpful. There's one other point. Just want to make one quick point, as we're slightly over time, so sorry. And then I'll thank the panel.
Can I come back to David Cameron's question about why don't we have a Google, etc.? The 5 companies are always the same 5 companies that are named: Amazon, eBay, Twitter, and the other 2. 3 of these organisations are 20 years old, and the other 2 are 10 years old. There aren't that many opportunities. The reason is these companies support virtual communities. Okay, so once you're there, you've got the market. It's not like building an accounting package to try to compete with Sage. Not that you do that now, but you would have done that 20, 30 years ago. So that's where we are. That's the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Is that they're for virtual communities. The opportunity is to look at where all the societal and economic value is tied up in IT and is tied up in public service applications in hospitals, GPs, etc., and taking the same approach to virtual communities for that one healthcare application that everybody uses. And unless we do that, then we're never going to move forward. And the problem we have in the UK, as we're talking about innovation, sorry, I should say, I'm based in Nadhim's constituency, is that in GDS, we have a very narrow definition of what good looks like for digitisation. And we need to change this because it's not putting lipstick on the pig we need. Go to the electoral register if you want to see get more information on that. We need to fundamentally redesign public service computing for virtual communities.
Good. Thank you very much. Time is against us. I want to thank you to the panel, Adrian, Steve, Nadhim, and Gerard, and thank you to you, the audience. Thank you very much.